Dawn creeps over Tower Green like a reluctant confession. The grass is damp with May dew, the air cool enough to sting the lungs, and somewhere beyond the walls the Thames breathes its slow, tidal sigh. A small scaffold waits under a pale sky, its straw scattered carefully, more for decorum than mercy. Ravens hop along the palings, curious, unafraid. When the gates open, a murmur rolls through the crowd and then breaks into silence. She enters, slight and composed, a dark figure trimmed in fur, her steps measured as if crossing a chapel floor instead of a wooden platform built for endings. Anne Boleyn's ladies gather her hair beneath a linen coif. Fingers tremble, but hers do not. She looks outward, past faces craning for a glimpse, past pikes and polished helms, toward nothing anyone else can see. The French swordsman stands a little apart, courteous, almost delicate, a blade master summoned from Calais because the king preferred a cleaner stroke. A prayer rises, soft as breath. She asks the people to hold no malice, to pray for the king. A gentler prince was never, she says without bitterness, and then kneels, carefully, the way she once knelt to be crowned. There is a trick the executioner uses. He calls for his sword, as if it isn't already in his hands, and when the condemned turns instinctively, the end arrives, swift as light. But before steel flashes, a stranger thought intrudes. 3 summers ago she was triumph itself, ringed in gold, adored, and feared. How does a crown turn to straw so quickly? To answer that, we must go back to the moment the hunt began. Imagine England in the late 1520s. The Tudor court glitters with gold, silk, and ambition. Candlelight flickers across polished floors in Hampton Court, where the air smells of beeswax and spiced wine. Courtiers whisper in alcoves, eyes darting toward the throne room where King Henry VIII sits. A man still young, broad-shouldered, and burning with restless desire. His queen, Catherine of Aragon, dutiful and pious, grows older, with no surviving sons to secure the Tudor dynasty. The shadow of uncertainty hangs over the realm, and into that shadow steps a woman who will change everything. Anne Boleyn did not arrive at court as a rival queen. She came as a lady-in-waiting, first to Margaret of Austria in the Low Countries, then to the glittering court of France, where she absorbed the refined manners, wit, and daring charm of the Renaissance elite. By the time she returned to England, she was no ordinary courtier. She spoke fluent French, danced with effortless grace, and carried herself with a magnetism that seemed to draw every eye in the room. She was not the most beautiful woman by traditional standards. Her features were sharp, her complexion darker than fashion preferred, but she possessed a force of personality that made her unforgettable. Henry had already noticed her sister, Mary Boleyn, who for a time had been his mistress. But Anne was different. She was clever enough to keep him at arm's length, refusing to be just another passing fancy. Letters survive, written in the king's own hand, where Henry begs for her favor. In them he vacillates between tenderness and desperation, promising her titles, jewels, and love eternal, if only she will give herself to him. But Anne had learned from France that power lay not in surrender, but in restraint. She would not be his mistress. She would be his wife, or she would be nothing. This refusal transformed her from curiosity to obsession. Henry's desire became a storm that battered against the walls of his marriage to Catherine. The court watched in astonishment as the King of England pursued a woman with a single-mindedness that bordered on madness. Anne became the center of gossip, both admired and despised. Her enemies called her a witch, a seductress who ensnared the king with spells. Her supporters whispered that she was destined by Providence to bring forth the male heir England so desperately needed. But to marry Anne, Henry would have to do the unthinkable, defy the Pope himself. Thus began the great matter, the king's attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine. The stage was set for a clash that would shatter England's ties to Rome ignite decades of religious upheaval, and place Anne Boleyn on a throne that would one day become her scaffold. And as the court held its breath, Anne herself moved like a figure lit by firelight, half in shadow, half in brilliance, aware that every step she took carried her closer to both glory and destruction. The year is 1527, and thunder rumbles over England, not from the skies, but from the throne. In his chambers at Greenwich Palace, Henry VIII paces restlessly, the fire in the hearth throwing wild shadows across the tapestries of hunting scenes. His mind is fixed on one idea, one consuming hunger. Anne Boleyn must be his wife. Yet his path is blocked by the very laws of God, or at least by Rome's interpretation of them. Catherine of Aragon, his queen of nearly 2 decades, kneels in prayer while rumors swirl through the court like smoke. She has given Henry one daughter, the Princess Mary, but no son. Each failed pregnancy weighs heavily on her, and with each year her chances of bearing another child shrink. To Henry, this is not merely misfortune, it is divine judgment. He convinces himself that his marriage to Catherine is cursed, tainted from the start because she had once been wed to his brother, Prince Arthur. Though their union was short and unconsummated, Catherine swore it before God. Henry seizes upon a passage from Leviticus. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. Anne's presence makes this argument burn hotter. She fuels Henry's conviction that providence demands change. He cannot be bound to Catherine. He must set her aside and raise Anne to queen. This is not just desire, it becomes destiny, but Catherine will not yield. In the Great Hall of Blackfriars in 1529, she kneels before her husband in full view of the court. Candlelight glimmers on her jeweled headdress as she speaks words that pierce the air like arrows. I have been your true wife these 20 years or more. When ye had me at first, I take God to be my judge. I was a true maid, without touch of man. Her Spanish pride and her unyielding dignity make her a formidable opponent. The spectators murmur, some moved to tears, as Catherine appeals not just to Henry's conscience, but to the people's hearts. Henry turns instead to the Pope. But Rome is in chaos. Only a year earlier, Pope Clement VII had been virtually imprisoned when Emperor Charles V, Catherine's own nephew, sacked Rome with his imperial troops. The Pope cannot risk angering Charles by annulling Catherine's marriage. The papal court stalls, drags its feet, and sends endless letters of delay. Henry grows more furious with each passing month. At court, Anne plays her role with exquisite precision. She refuses Henry's bed, but grants him her wit, her companionship, and just enough affection to keep him desperate. Her enemies seethe. Thomas Wolsey, the cardinal who once ruled England's politics like a colossus, fails to secure the annulment, and his downfall follows swiftly. Henry's frustration becomes Anne's triumph, for she whispers of another path. England need not bow to Rome. This idea, radical and dangerous, begins to take shape. In the smoky taverns of London, whispers stir that the king may break with the Pope himself. Scholars at Cambridge and Oxford debate Luther's writings, some daring to suggest that the Pope's authority is not divine but human, fallible, corrupt. Thomas Cranmer, an ambitious cleric with a sharp mind, steps forward with a proposal. Let the universities of Europe weigh in. Let England's king be judged not by Rome, but by learned men across Christendom. Henry seizes on the plan, but beneath the scholarship the truth is simpler. He will not wait for Rome. His will is the law. And through all this, Anne shines like a flame, admired, envied, hated. Her French gowns, her sharp tongue, her fearless confidence mark her as something new, something foreign, almost dangerous. She carries herself, not as a mistress in waiting, but as a queen already crowned in spirit. Her enemies mutter that she bewitches the king. Her supporters insist she is England's hope, the woman destined to give Henry the son he craves. The court divides into factions. Families stake their futures on Catherine or Anne. Whispers of betrayal hiss through palace corridors, and the air grows thick with danger. The great matter is no longer just about a marriage. It is about power, faith, and the very soul of England. One truth becomes clear: the storm cannot pass quietly. Something will break: Catherine, the Pope, or England itself. Winter yields to spring in 1533, and with it comes a revolution dressed as a wedding. The court whispers that Anne Boleyn is already carrying Henry's child, the long-awaited heir, and the king will no longer wait on Rome. In a secret ceremony, Henry takes Anne as his lawful wife, defying the Pope, defying Christendom, defying centuries of obedience to the Holy See. When word spreads, shock ripples across Europe. To Catherine's supporters, it is heresy. To Henry, it is salvation. To Anne, it is triumph. But triumph comes wrapped in peril. Catherine of Aragon is banished to increasingly remote castles, stripped of her title, but not her dignity. She continues to call herself queen, writing letters signed as such, her iron will refusing to bend. Her daughter Mary is declared illegitimate, a bastard in the eyes of the law. Father and daughter are torn apart. Courtiers report the girl weeping, but Mary inherits her mother's stubbornness. She refuses to accept Anne as queen, a defiance that will one day burn through England like wildfire. Anne, meanwhile, steps into the role she has fought so fiercely to claim. Her coronation is a spectacle unlike any in memory. Barges line the Thames as she sails toward Westminster in a gown of white and gold. Bells toll, trumpets blare, and tapestries of saints and angels flutter in the summer air. Yet behind the cheers lies unease. Many Londoners mutter that Catherine is their rightful queen. Some refuse to illuminate their houses in celebration. Even as Anne walks barefooted into Westminster Abbey, crowned with St. Edward's crown itself, she feels the hostility of a nation that views her as usurper, not savior. The months that follow are charged with both joy and dread. Anne is pregnant, and Henry's hope swells with hers. He speaks of destiny, of providence, of a son who will secure the Tudor line. He hovers over Anne, lavishing her with gifts, palaces, jewels, titles. To secure her safety, he declares himself supreme head of the Church of England, severing forever the chain that bound his kingdom to Rome. The monasteries tremble, monks and nuns whisper of ruin, and the Pope thunders excommunication. But Henry is unmoved. His new wife glows with child, and in his mind, England's future grows in her womb. September 7, 1533, the great day dawns. Anne labors within the walls of Greenwich Palace. Outside, nobles gather, ready to celebrate the birth of a prince. Cannons wait to roar across the Thames, prepared to announce England's heir. But when the midwives emerge, their faces are pale. A girl. The child is a girl. The infant Elizabeth is healthy, fierce-voiced, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's fiery red hair. But Henry's joy is muted, shadowed by bitter disappointment. He tries to mask it, insisting that sons will follow, yet the truth settles like cold stone. Anne's first great promise is unfulfilled. At court, enemies circle. The Spanish ambassador sneers in his letters, calling Elizabeth a poor consolation prize. Catherine's supporters whisper that God has spoken, that Anne's reign is cursed. Even among Henry's allies, there is unease. Anne's sharp tongue, her fiery temper, her refusal to play the meek consort. These traits that once intoxicated the king now cut like blades in the tense silence of the council chamber. Anne herself feels the shift. She has risen higher than any Boleyn could dream, but the crown she wears is heavy, its thorns pressing deeper with every breath. She throws herself into Elizabeth's care, into political maneuvering, into religious reform, determined to secure her place. Yet she knows, perhaps better than anyone, that a queen without a son walks on a scaffold long before she sees it. The game has changed. Anne is no longer the flame that lured Henry from Catherine. She is his wife, his queen, and the mother of his child. And in a court built on ambition and betrayal, that is the most dangerous position of all. The corridors of Whitehall echo with laughter, but beneath the music and merriment lies a darker rhythm. Anne Boleyn, once untouchable, now feels the ground shifting beneath her feet. In her private chambers, she clasps Elizabeth in her arms, gazing down at the infant who should have secured her triumph. But Henry's gaze grows colder with each passing month. He still visits, still smiles, still speaks of love. But behind his words, there is a restless hunger. Anne knows that hunger well. It once elevated her. Now it threatens to destroy her. The problem is not only Elizabeth's sex, but Anne's temper. She has never been a meek queen. When Henry strays, she rages. When counselors resist her reforms, she lashes out. Her sharp wit, which once charmed, now cuts too deep. She mocks Wolsey's fall, insults Catherine's daughter Mary, and quarrels openly with Henry himself. The court, always watchful, seizes on these cracks. To her enemies, Anne is no longer the brilliant flame that dazzled the king. She is a dangerous fire that must be extinguished. Then comes 1534, and with it both triumph and danger. Parliament passes the Act of Supremacy, confirming Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England. It is a momentous victory, one Anne herself helped shape. Monasteries groan under the weight of dissolution, relics are seized, and loyalists to Rome are branded traitors. Yet this power rests not only on Henry's shoulders, but on Anne's as well. For her enemies, especially the conservative faction led by the Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, she is the heretic temptress who lured the king into schism. If she stumbles, the fury of both Rome and England will crash upon her. Anne becomes pregnant again, and hope surges. Perhaps God will now grant the prince she promised. The entire kingdom watches her belly with anxious eyes. Henry beams once more, convinced his heir is on the way. But in early 1534, the child is lost. A miscarriage. Anne lies in her chamber, the scent of rosemary and vinegar heavy in the air, midwives whispering in frightened tones. The king enters, his face pale, his lips tight. He comforts her with words, but his eyes reveal something colder. Disappointment, sharpening into resentment. The whispers grow louder. Some mutter that Anne is bewitched, cursed, her womb unfit to carry a prince. Others claim her temper drives Henry away from her bed, dooming her chances of conceiving again. At court, rivals rise. Jane Seymour, quiet, fair, and obedient. Everything Anne is not. She slips into Henry's notice like a shadow, her modesty presented as virtue. Anne senses the danger immediately. One evening, she discovers Henry's gift of a locket around Jane's neck, his portrait painted inside. Anne rips it from her chest in fury, her hands shaking. But Henry only glares, the silence heavier than any shouted rebuke. Meanwhile, Anne's enemies plot. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, begins to turn. Their quarrel is over power. She seeks to direct the spoils of the monasteries toward charitable reform. He seeks to funnel wealth into the king's treasury. Their clash grows public, dangerous. Cromwell is a master of survival, a man who can turn whispers into daggers. He begins to weave a net around her, quietly gathering her missteps, her rash words, her enemies, venomous tales. And yet, for all the growing shadows, Anne does not bow. She continues to push for reform, championing English translations of the Bible, shielding scholars accused of heresy, and pressing Henry to shape England into a new, reformed kingdom. To her allies, she is a heroine of faith. To her enemies, she is a usurper queen, arrogant and cursed. But in the silence of her chambers, when Elizabeth sleeps and the candles burn low, Anne knows the truth she cannot speak. Every day she spends without bearing a son tightens the noose. Every frown from Henry, every smile from Jane Seymour, every whisper in the council chambers is a step toward the scaffold. The game is no longer about triumph. It is about survival. The spring of 1536 arrives with a chill that seeps through stone walls and velvet gowns alike. In the royal chambers at Greenwich, Anne Boleyn feels her last chance slipping through her hands. She is pregnant again. Hope stirs like a fragile candle flame. If she can give Henry a son, all will be saved. Her enemies will be silenced, her crown secured, her daughter Elizabeth strengthened as heir alongside a brother. But fate moves in cruel circles. In late January, the Queen suffers another miscarriage. The loss comes on the very day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral. Courtiers whisper that the ghost of the wronged Queen has cursed Anne's womb. The child, some claim, was a boy. The moment Henry hears, the light in his eyes changes. He mutters bitter words that strike Anne like blows. God will not give me sons. And now Jane Seymour waits in the wings. Pale, gentle, pliant, she plays her role perfectly. Where Anne burned with fire, Jane offers cool obedience. Henry begins to dine with her, to gift her jewels, to show her a tenderness once reserved only for Anne. The court takes note, and the whispers grow louder. The king is seeking a way out. Thomas Cromwell sees his moment. Once Anne's ally, he has grown tired of her interference. She has insulted him publicly, challenged his control of the treasury, and threatened to destroy him. Now, with Henry's love faltering, Cromwell weaves his snare. He begins to collect rumors, bending them into daggers. A careless smile at a courtier, a jest exchanged with a musician, a touch of the hand in passing. Each harmless act becomes evidence in his ledger. By April, the net is ready. Cromwell accuses Anne not only of adultery but of treason, of betraying the king with men of his own household, even her own brother, George Boleyn. It is a crime that shocks the realm, but Cromwell knows how to play the game. The charges are impossible, grotesque, but in the poisoned air of court politics, plausibility is not required, only opportunity. On May 2nd, Anne is arrested. She is summoned from her chambers at Greenwich, confusion etched across her face as guards escort her onto the Thames barge bound for the Tower. Once, she had sailed this same river crowned in glory, bells ringing, Londoners watching in awe. Now she glides in silence, her ladies weeping, her crown of gold replaced with a hood drawn low over her face. At the Tower, she is lodged in the royal apartments, the very rooms once prepared for her coronation. The irony is bitter, almost cruel. Anne holds her head high, insisting on her innocence. "I am the king's true wife," she declares. Yet each day brings new horrors. Her brother is dragged before the council, accused of unspeakable crimes. Henry Norris, her loyal friend, is named a lover. Even a court musician, Mark Smeaton, is tortured until he confesses to sins he never committed. Anne is questioned repeatedly, her sharp tongue flashing even in despair. When accused of mocking Henry's virility, she laughs bitterly. "My jest was only words, but they will undo me." She knows now the truth. Cromwell does not want justice. He wants her destroyed. Henry never visits. He withdraws into the company of Jane Seymour, feasting, hunting, and speaking already of new beginnings. For Anne, the silence is more painful than any sword. The man who once vowed eternal devotion who tore his kingdom from Rome to have her, will not lift a finger to save her. The trial is held at Westminster Hall. Anne stands before a jury of peers, many of them her bitterest enemies. She pleads not with tears but with defiance. I am no traitor. Her words echo against the vaulted ceilings, but they fall on deaf ears. The verdict is decided before the trial begins. Guilty of adultery, guilty of treason, guilty of conspiring the king's death. The sentence, to be burned alive or beheaded, at the king's mercy. Anne listens calmly, her face pale but unbroken. Later she whispers to one of her ladies, I shall receive death with good will, for I have done no wrong. The court has spoken. Cromwell has triumphed. Jane Seymour waits to be queen, and Anne, once the brightest flame in England, now walks in the lengthening shadow of the scaffold. The Tower of London in May 1536 is not the fortress of war it once was. It is a stage for tragedy. Within its thick stone walls, Anne Boleyn spends her last days waiting. The apartments she occupies were once prepared for her coronation, hung with rich tapestries, scented with roses. Now they are stripped bare, the only fragrance the damp of the Thames drifting through iron-barred windows. Her ladies-in-waiting, chosen carefully by Cromwell, are both companions and spies. Every word Anne utters is carried back to her enemies. She knows it, and yet she speaks freely, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping, sometimes whispering prayers, until her lips tremble with exhaustion. One evening she says with bitter irony, They cannot accuse me of being unchaste before my marriage, but now I am condemned as the greatest harlot in Christendom. The women turn their faces, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Anne receives the news of her brother George's death with a calmness that astonishes even her jailers. He too was convicted on false charges, condemned for crimes unthinkable. When she hears he died bravely, declaring his innocence, she clasps her hands and whispers, God, have mercy on his soul, and on mine. Henry does not come. The man who once wrote love letters in his own hand, who called her his most dear and entirely beloved, now feasts with Jane Seymour at Wolf Hall. Anne knows she has been abandoned, yet her spirit remains unbroken. To one of her ladies she says, I have only a little neck. She wraps her hands around her slender throat, managing a smile. The morning of May 19th dawns cold and clear. The scaffold has been erected on Tower Green, surrounded by ranks of soldiers holding back the crowd. Nobles, merchants, commoners, all have gathered to witness the fall of a queen. The French swordsman waits, summoned at Henry's request for a swift and merciful execution. His blade gleams, curved and deadly. Anne steps onto the platform dressed in a gown of gray damask, her mantle of crimson trimmed with ermine. A linen coif hides her hair. Her face is pale but composed, her dark eyes bright with something beyond fear, something like acceptance. She turns to the crowd and speaks with a steady voice. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. I am the king's faithful wife, but I submit to the law. I pray for his majesty, for he is a gracious prince. I commend my soul to God. There is no bitterness, no accusation, only dignity. She kneels upright, refusing the block, her hands folded in prayer. The swordsman steps forward. He calls out for his sword, a distraction to make her turn her head. She does, instinctively. In that instant, the blade flashes, swift and silent. The crowd gasps, then falls into stunned quiet. The Queen of England is gone. Anne's body is placed in an arrow chest, too small for her remains, and buried hurriedly in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower walls. No monument, no grand procession, only silence. Yet her death does not end her story. Within 3 years, her daughter Elizabeth, once dismissed as a disappointment, will rise as heir to England. And one day, that same child will sit upon the throne as Elizabeth I, the greatest monarch the Tudors would ever know. Anne's enemies sought to erase her. Instead, they gave her immortality. She was not merely a queen who lost her head. She became a symbol of the dangers and brilliance of ambition, of the fragility of power, and of the terrible price women pay for stepping into the world of kings. The axe never touched her. Her death was quick, but her legacy cuts deeper than any sword. The scaffold on Tower Green was swept clean long ago, yet Anne Boleyn's shadow never left it. For centuries, her story has haunted England like a restless spirit, part cautionary tale, part legend, part prophecy fulfilled. She was not the meek consort the world expected. She was sharper, fiercer, too bold for her time. Her enemies called her witch, harlot, traitor. Her supporters saw her as reformer, mother, and queen. Perhaps she was all of these, or none. What is certain is that she reshaped England. Her marriage to Henry split the kingdom from Rome, forever changing the soul of the nation. Her fall showed how quickly crowns can turn to nooses, how love in a palace can become death in a courtyard. Yet her truest legacy was not written in laws or papal bulls, but in the life of her daughter. Elizabeth Tudor, born to disappointment, dismissed as useless, would grow into the Virgin Queen, ruling with a strength and brilliance that eclipsed even her father. In Elizabeth's reign, Anne lived again, in her wit, her fire, her defiance of a world that sought to silence her. Anne Boleyn's life was brief, her end cruel, but in the sweep of history she triumphed. For while her body was laid in an unmarked grave, her name endured, whispered through stone halls, and sung across centuries. The queen who lost her head gave England a crown more enduring than her own, the crown of a daughter who would never surrender it.